When Emily Carter walked into the Monday morning leadership meeting at North Star Surgical Logistics in Denver, Colorado, she expected the announcement she had been waiting nearly 2 years to hear. Because after 11 years of rebuilding warehouses, solving emergency hospital deliveries, training managers, and quietly carrying responsibilities far beyond her title, she believed the vacant operations director position would finally become hers. But instead, company president Richard Sloan stood at the head of the table and introduced his 29-year-old nephew, Brandon Sloan, as the company's new director of operations, effective immediately. Emily felt the room change before anyone spoke, yet Richard only smiled and said, "Brandon brings the leadership perspective we need." While Brandon shook her hand and added, "I'm counting on you to teach me the details." And although Emily wanted to remind them that she had already been doing the job they were handing him, she simply replied, "I'll make sure the transition is organised." Because something inside her had just stopped fighting for recognition and started paying attention to what came next. For the next several weeks, Brandon treated North Star like a machine that could be fixed by changing numbers on a dashboard. While Emily watched him remove backup carriers, cancel supplier risk meetings, simplify emergency procedures, and dismiss warnings she had spent years documenting after surviving winter shortages, hospital emergencies, equipment failures, and shipping disruptions that never appeared in quarterly reports. One afternoon, Brandon held up her emergency response manual and laughed, saying, "Emily, half of this is unnecessary complexity." And she calmly answered, "Those pages were written after things went wrong." But when he replied, "That is exactly why I'm here, to make sure they don't happen again," she said nothing, because she knew the most dangerous people in operations were not always the ones who made mistakes, but the ones who believed experience was outdated simply because they had not yet experienced the consequences. Emily had joined North Star as a warehouse coordinator when the company operated from one aging distribution centre outside Denver, and over the years she became the person who knew which hospital administrator would answer an emergency call at midnight, which supplier would release a critical shipment without unnecessary paperwork, which trucking company could find a refrigerated vehicle during a holiday weekend, and which seemingly minor inventory discrepancy could become a crisis 6 hours later. She had repeatedly asked Richard to create backup leadership and cross-training plans, but every proposal was postponed with excuses about budgets, restructuring, or the right time. And when the former operations director retired, Richard told Emily, "Take over temporarily while we decide what comes next," promising that her promotion was practically guaranteed, so she accepted the additional workload, spent 18 months performing director-level responsibilities without the title, and slowly realised that the company had discovered something more convenient than promoting her. It could simply keep relying on her. The breaking point came when Brandon announced a modernisation initiative and presented several ideas as his own, including a supplier risk system, emergency routing matrix, and cross-training program that Emily had designed months earlier and submitted to Richard. And when she quietly asked, "Where did you get those recommendations?" Brandon smiled and said, "I've been studying the operation," while Richard added, "Let's focus on the future instead of keeping score." But Emily did not argue because she suddenly understood that arguing would only prove they still controlled the conversation. That evening, instead of preparing another report for North Star, Emily went home, opened an old email from a recruiter named Samantha Reed, and finally returned a call she had ignored for nearly a year, telling Samantha, "I'm ready to hear what you have." And for the first time in 11 years, Emily allowed herself to imagine a career where her judgment was not merely tolerated when everything went wrong, but respected before the crisis happened. Samantha connected her with Pacific Meridian Health Supply, a growing medical distribution company based in Portland, Oregon, whose chief operating officer, Laura Bennett, spent almost an hour asking Emily questions no one at North Star had asked in years, including what happens when growth outruns infrastructure, why experienced employees become single points of failure, and how a company can build emergency systems without turning every normal day into bureaucracy. Emily answered without revealing a single confidential North Star customer, price, contract, or supplier detail, because she understood that her real value was not hidden information, but 11 years of accumulated judgment. And when Laura finally asked, "If I gave you the authority to rebuild an operations division properly, what would you do first?" Emily paused before saying, "I'd make sure no emergency depends on one person remembering what to do." And 3 days later, she received an offer for a senior operations leadership position with higher compensation, meaningful authority, and a mandate to build the system she had spent years begging North Star to create. Emily accepted the offer quietly and gave North Star the notice required by company policy. But Richard reacted as though she had betrayed him, saying, "After everything we've invested in you, you're really leaving now." And Emily looked directly at him before answering, "I'm not leaving because the company failed to promote me, Richard. I'm leaving because I finally understand that you were never planning to." Brandon, meanwhile, insisted 6 weeks would be necessary for a proper transition. But Emily documented every existing procedure, open risk, pending renewal, supplier issue, hospital escalation, and emergency contact she was responsible for. Then required Brandon to acknowledge each handoff in writing, refusing to secretly carry responsibilities after her final day, and refusing to hide information that legitimately belonged to the company. 2 days after Emily left, North Star encountered a chain of problems that would have been routine under the old system, but became serious because the new system had never actually been tested. As a critical surgical equipment shipment missed a refrigerated pickup, a backup carrier refused the emergency rate because its agreement had expired, and a major supplier temporarily froze an order after Brandon challenged fees without understanding the settlement history behind them. By Monday morning, hospital purchasing departments were demanding answers. Warehouse supervisors were asking who could approve substitutions, and Richard suddenly realised that the simple operation Brandon believed he had inherited was actually a network of relationships, safeguards, historical decisions, and contingency plans that Emily had spent years quietly maintaining. So Richard called her repeatedly, and when she finally answered, his voice was stripped of its usual authority as he said, "Emily, we need your help." To which she calmly replied, "I gave you the information before I left. You chose not to build the support around it." Eventually asked Emily to provide short-term consulting assistance, but she agreed only after her new employer approved it, and only under strict boundaries that prevented her from returning as Brandon's unofficial emergency department. And during a tense executive meeting, Richard tried to suggest that Emily's departure had caused the operational failures until Laura, who had joined the call, asked for documentation, prompting Emily to present the signed transition checklist, dated emails, risk warnings, and cancelled training sessions that proved every major issue had been communicated before she left. The room went silent when Emily showed that Brandon had personally cancelled a training session titled Emergency Freight and Backup Carrier Controls. And even Richard could not explain why the exact risk now threatening North Star had been documented in advance, while the company's CEO finally turned to Brandon and said, "This isn't a transition failure, this is a leadership failure." And within weeks, Brandon was removed from operational control, while the board began reviewing Richard's decision to place a family member into a critical leadership role without the required experience. Emily never returned permanently, even when North Star offered her the director title, a substantial raise, and a retention package that would have been unimaginable a year earlier, because she realised the title meant very little when it was offered only after her absence became expensive. At Pacific Meridian, she built the department she had always wanted. Every critical account had backup ownership. Supplier risks were reviewed before emergencies. Managers rotated through escalation training, and nobody was praised for becoming so indispensable that the entire operation would struggle without them. And one afternoon, after Emily intentionally took 3 days away from work, Laura called her only to say, "Everything ran exactly as planned," and Emily smiled because that sentence meant more to her than any promotion ever could. A year after leaving North Star, Emily stood before a room of operations managers at Pacific Meridian and asked them what would happen if the primary carrier failed tomorrow. And instead of everyone looking at her, 2 managers immediately explained the backup plan. Another described the supplier escalation process, and a fourth confirmed that the largest hospital account had 2 trained owners who could handle an emergency without her involvement. Emily realised then that she had spent years believing being constantly needed was proof of her value, when the real measure of leadership was creating a team strong enough to succeed without you. And although she never celebrated Richard's downfall or Brandon's failure, she felt proud that the experience had forced her to stop waiting for someone else to decide what she was worth. Please subscribe to our channel and share this video with your friends and family. We create entertaining and inspiring stories for our viewers, and your support helps us continue making great content for you.